Welcome everyone to this webinar, our call to heal Australia's land, seas and waterways. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded lands of where I am calling in from in Naarm, Melbourne. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and also acknowledge the traditional owners from where everyone here is calling in from across Australia. I'd also like to call out the vital role Indigenous people continue to play in caring for country and to acknowledge the importance of giving priority to Indigenous custodianship when it comes to addressing impacts on country, which we'll be discussing today. So welcome particularly to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here. My name is Jo Sanson, and I'm privileged to have been invited to moderate this discussion. I work for Climate Work Centre, an independent not-for-profit housed within Monash University, and lead their Land Use Futures program. This program was established to provide analysis and advice on how to address the complex challenge of balancing climate, biodiversity and agricultural production goals in Australia's land sector. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the important perspectives that our panellists provide. And shortly, I'll be introducing my fellow panelists and having a conversation with them about their new call for action, why they are making this call now, and what we can do as a country to better care for and heal Australia's land, seas and waterways. But before we do, we'd like to hear from you, our audience, in the chat. So please tell us who you are, your organisation or your interest in this area, and what Indigenous country you reside in or are dialing in from. You'll find the chat at the bottom of the screen, and you will need to select all panelists and attendees to introduce yourselves. In addition to the chat function, you should also see a button for Q&A down the bottom. We'll be closing off the chat in a few moments, but clicking on this button will bring up a panel where you can ask questions that I will put to our speakers in our panel discussion during the second half of the webinar. You'll also be able to see and like other people's questions. We're expecting quite a few questions from our large audience, and we'll try to get to as many as possible, but please do upvote any questions that you think are particularly important, and we'll prioritise getting to those. We'll also be sending around the recording to everyone registered, along with some more information. So please don't worry if we don't get to cover everything today. So it's really wonderful to see so many people from many different backgrounds and regions joining us today. I'm just looking at the chat here. So welcome everyone, and let us now get started with the topic that we're here to talk about. So the call to heal Australia's land, seas and waterways has been brought together by a small working group of people who work to improve and restore the health of Australia's environment. These are people who work as part of the natural resource management sector, with Indigenous groups, caring for country groups, and with many others doing this important work around Australia. We are here to help them launch this call and to share ideas about what we can do and are doing to look after the heritage that we're all privileged to share. And colleague Sarge has just posted a link in the chat to this call. So I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Mike Grundy. Mike has a long-standing research interest in spatial soil and landscape science and how it is applied in agriculture, forest production, and environmental protection. He has worked in government and the research sector and has led major multidisciplinary natural resource assessment activities for over 30 years. So Mike, I understand that this call today is being put out in response to the Wentworth Group's recent blueprint to repair Australia's landscapes, which of course you were very involved in. Could you please tell us about the report and let us know about some of its key findings to get us started?
Thank you, Jo, and hello, everyone. Well, I'll start with a little bit of history, I suppose. Well before the decade of land care and the first National Land and Water Resources Audit and the other one, and then national action plans, all of those things that many of you are aware of, we have known the need for repairing our landscapes. But despite some truly innovative local approaches, internationally innovative, and a realisation of the First Nation custodianship, we've not responded at scale or with persistence. In fact, the State of Environment reports has really merely served to document our slow pace in doing this. Repair is, of course, essential, and it's urgent as we enter this most challenging of centuries. It's hard enough to thrive on a degraded landscape. It's harder if climate change is battering you in its various ways. So with that background and that history, Wentworth Group asked the question, What would it take to repair our landscapes at sufficient scale and across our interconnected systems? Is it feasible? Is it affordable? We know it is essential. We aim to be as systematic as possible, or systemic as possible, and looked at agricultural soils, river systems, water catchments, native ecosystems, extension risk, and estuaries. We trawled through data systems, we wrote or commissioned new papers, and we consulted a large number of relevant, knowledgeable people. I think somewhere in the order of 70 to 80 people. The result is that we have published that it is not only essential, it is both feasible and affordable. We estimate the cost at being $7 billion per annum over 30 years, with $250 million per year maintenance beyond that. And I won't go through all of the details for this because it's all in the blueprint and the technical document that's available attached to this meeting and also at the Wentworth website. But importantly, this was a national overview. We also realised that the other aspect of feasibility was to find solutions at the scale at which our landscape is lived in, managed, shared. So we realise that the repair will have to take different shapes across our country, matching our diverse landscapes, societies, industries, and other things. So yes, it's feasible, but the feasibility requires a regional scale and breadth across our regional societies. Hence the next phase, and hence this. And so I'll pass it back to you, Joe, with that introduction.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I think, I think you've just sort of touched on just what a mammoth and very important effort that blueprint has been. And also, while I think getting across sort of the urgency of the call to action, it's also just so heartening to hear, the conclusions around this really being feasible as well, which I'm sure are the issues we're going to be talking about a lot more in a few moments. So our second speaker is Dr. Kate Andrews. So Kate is the CEO of NRM Regions Australia, and she has a diverse professional background across Australia. So she worked to establish the Cross-Border Lake Air Basin Group and became its first CEO. She was Land and Water Australia's first knowledge and adoption manager and has chaired and reformed the Northern Territory's NRM organisation. She has participated in many national committees, advisory groups and boards. So Kate, your organisation, NRM Regions Australia, has helped create this call, responding to the Wentworth Group's blueprint. Can you please tell us why you think this is important and what role you believe the natural resource manager sector has to play here?
Thanks, Joe. Thanks very much. And thanks also to Mike. Firstly, I'm joining you from the lands of the Yuin people in beautiful South Coast, New South Wales. Look, I think Mike did a wonderful leading to exactly why we're here today, and that is the acknowledgement and reaffirmation that we must restore our country. We need to do it now. And that key point Mike makes, that we can afford to do it. In fact, we can't afford not to do it. But the other thing that I really want to build upon, and the reason why we were so keen to do this joint statement, is the points that they make in the blueprint, which is we know how to do this. And in fact, we're doing it. People right across the country. And it's just been wonderful to see the chat and to see that people are joining us from Arnhem Land, from Limestone Coast in South Australia, from Perth and Perth NRM, and right across to Sydney. I think we've got Ocean Watch, who are at the Sydney fish markets. So that diversity that we see here in the chat just sums up already just what a remarkable network we have out there already doing this work. So to build upon that platform of the existing capacity, frameworks, the potential, all those people out there, those networks that are already getting out there doing the restoration of country, but we need to scale it up. We must have more investment in that. So it's how we do that investment. The other key point I wanted to pick up from Mike, which is just core to regional natural resource management, is that issue of the landscape scale and integration. So for me to see the acknowledgement from the Wentworth Group that for us to actually make this difference, we have to move beyond doing the ad hoc bitsy work across the country. We actually need to be doing it at the right scale. We need to make sure it's interconnected. and we need to make sure it's place-based. And those are points that come through really strongly in the Wentworth Group's report. And those are fundamental principles that we apply in regional natural resource management and through regional natural resource management planning. So really, really, really key. There's lots of wonderful examples of what that looks like on the ground at different scales. There's some great examples. I think there's a link from the media release onto the NRM Regions Australia website, and it gives you some great examples. One in South Australia of some fantastic monitoring of the sandhill dunnart with the Sejuna school group. Another example working in carbon plus biodiversity across in WA with farmers. So there's so much out there that we'd like to build upon. Final point though, partnerships. Actually having the opportunity to sit at the table with Indigenous colleagues such as Tegan, scientist colleagues such as Mike, and sit down and talk about how we get that scale up and what we need to do together and how we get that call out to others was a really important element of doing this joint statement for me. And that reflects the partnerships that are required for us to make the change at the scale that is required and with the urgency.
Thanks very much, Kate. And I think all very wise words, of course. And I think, yeah, as you say, you know, that sort of critical role of partnership to be realizing this vision and this blueprint, and you know, and bringing these people together today is, of course, part of that as well. So great to hear those thoughts. So Tegan, now over to you. So Tegan is a proud Arabana woman. She's our third speaker here today, and she has worked in the community engagement and environmental sector for over 15 years, including in New South Wales, Queensland, and WA, as well as at an international level as an ambassador to the World Indigenous Network. She has worked in government in WA, coordinating community engagement with remote Aboriginal communities, and she is a member of a range of expert groups and advisory bodies, and she is now an Indigenous Research Fellow at Curtin Universities. So Tegan, can you please let us know why you decided to join the working group to pull together this call to heal Australia's land, seas and waterways, and why you think it's important for First Nations perspectives to be heard in this call?
Thanks, Jo, and hello to everyone. I'm coming from Whadjuk country. I just want to acknowledge my old people who, instill their wisdom in me to be able to participate in these conversations and acknowledge their custodianship and stewardship of country for millennia. Look, I think this is a really unique opportunity to come together as a collective and actually have, you know, a joined up statement where we're all working together. I've kind of been in this national space for some time, and this is the first time an opportunity like this to actually collaborate with NRM groups and researchers to come together and make a joint statement about what we can do to change the tide, I guess. And we're at a really critical point where we need to see action. I think importantly, from an Indigenous perspective, the Indigenous estate is quite large and is growing with 30 by 30 targets. And so we need to acknowledge, you know, the hard work that rangers and IPAs do in terms of conserving and healing country. And, you know, what a better way to do that than to respond to this, to say, actually, let's work collaboratively. Let's actually, you know, think about how we can do this together instead of in the competing restricted space that environmental funding often is. And I think that the blueprint really offers that opportunity to say, hey, we can do this, and there is enough funding to go around for everyone to be able to deliver those place-based aspirations.
Thanks, Tegan. No, that's great. And I think we're probably going to want to get a lot more into some of these questions of what that joined up sort of action and collaborative work will look like here. So, but yeah, no, it's wonderful to have you join. So a few follow-up questions here before and then we certainly will be wanting to hear from our audience as well. So we do have the Q&A button there. Please do add your questions in. So Mike, the Wentworth Group report lays out an ambitious agenda for repairing Australia's landscapes over the next 30 years. You've mentioned this a bit before, you know, saying, look, this is feasible, this is viable, but can you tell us a little bit more about why that's the case and how we can achieve this?
Thanks again, Jo. And I should have mentioned before that I am talking to you from the beautiful Kabi country, as I'm looking at my window at the left here. Yeah, look, the scientific understanding is not questioned here. The scientific understanding is well established. That's really not the feasibility question. The question became, is there room? What is the size of this? And then the next question becomes, how is it structured? How can we identify the trade-offs and the synergies that are involved in making this happen? How can they be identified and managed? So in a sense, what we wrote nationally, yes, we could draw a map of Australia and we could fit all the repair elements in that map. And in a sense, that's what the blueprint does. But it's with the regions that change needs to be nurtured. And in a sense, that is the important part of the feasibility element. This opportunity with NRM Australia, with NALSMA and the other partners is an essential part of that feasibility element, I think. So it was Wentworth's judgment, and it's in the report as well, that our regional NRM and First Nation groups have actually already shown us how to do this. The key thing is to provide them with scale and ensure persistence of support. And Wentworth's assessment of that length of persistence was 30 years. We don't want another 3 years or 4 years of a national action plan. It can't be done like that. This has to be done with persistence and with clarity that persistence is there. The other part of feasibility, though, is also the observed convergence that many of us are aware of interest and drivers in our regions. Now, all our agricultural industries now have strong sustainability, natural capital improvement, and climate targets built into their plans, their strategic plans. We all have to fit renewable energy needs somehow into our nature, into our landscapes, but do it in nature positive ways. And of course, carbon sequestration is growing as a product that comes out of our vast regions and for the way in which we will get serious about combating climate change. Now, and in fact, some work that we did when I was at CSIRO in the National Outlook said that if we are really going to be serious about climate change, really we don't have any choice about that, carbon's going to become an extremely valuable commodity coming out of our landscapes. Now, we could be pessimistic, and many of us have been, and say that we've not yet been able to support this level and persistence of action, or we could show what can be done and find the mechanisms to support it. And I think that's why we're all here. And if we take that view of it, then feasibility will happen.
Thanks, Mike. Good to get those thoughts and be reminded of that in the face of these big challenges. So one of the, the key issues that you said there was, about one of the reasons why this is feasible is because we do have that capability to be doing this planning at the regional level. So Kate, could you tell us a little bit more around why that landscape level planning and the integrated NRM planning, the natural resource management planning that your organisation does is so important here?
Sorry, mute. Someone had to do it. Aren't you all glad it was me? Look, just quickly, NRM Regions Australia is the peak body for the 54 regional NRM organisations right across the country who all do some form of regional NRM planning. But I also just want to do a call out, because often we can be very literal when we talk about plans and planning. And planning is in fact a nested thing. So you actually have plans that work together or feed into each other. So, for example, healthy country plans done, with rangers and IPAs are a really important element of planning and nested planning. Or sometimes you have very specific local plans or water management plans. All of those come together and fit together or interact with regional NRM plans. So planning is actually a process. And the other thing about planning too is it's actually about the participation and the people and the evidence and the knowledges that come together in that plan. So it's not the final product that sits on a shelf. We always have to remember that, and it draws upon so much information and so many networks with people. So just a heads up with that one. As far as integration, this is a really interesting one, and it's one that I feel like I'm always talking about the bleeding obvious when I talk about this, because to me, when I'm out there, it's all connected, right? Whether it's the water, whether it's the habitat connectivity for different species, whatever it might be, it's all connected across the landscape. And that means that we need to actually integrate across a landscape scale, whether it's across the land uses, the ecosystems, the tenures, all of those sorts of things, to actually get the outcomes that we need. And we've seen that. We've had decades of work that actually shows that if we do little bits everywhere, it doesn't get the scaled up response, or even worse, it might have negative outcomes. And that's why we work so hard to get regional NRM plans referred to in the carbon farming legislation, because we want to minimize those potentially negative outcomes when you're not actually coordinating across a landscape, but then maximize the benefits that you get from actually knitting that together. And it's that joining up the actions and the investments, which I think becomes a really key way to get the scale of change that we need, as Mike was saying, and that landscape scale. That becomes really important. I did also want to make another point about the planning too, that I think sometimes really gets left out. And it goes to the point Mike made too about carbon and carbon sequestration and the expectations, I think, that have been put onto the land sector, which includes Indigenous land managers, farmers, pastoralists, etc. And that is that they will do some heavy lifting with carbon sequestration. And that, of course, becomes a really important question about the values that we have for our land and the outcomes that we're seeking to actually be produced, in a sense, from that country. And this is where those conversations through planning at the right scale become really, really important as well, because it's about understanding and managing across those different and multiple values. And that helps us be proactive about decision making, so that you don't end up with destruction of values, whether they're cultural values, whether they're ecological values or community values, or important agricultural lands. You can actually protect against degrading values and leveraging investment to get the outcomes that you actually want. So that becomes a really important piece. And that also has to happen at multiple scales, but definitely at a landscape scale, as people see fit to get those best possible outcomes.
Thanks very much, Kate. Yeah, I think there was a lot there. I think bringing in that role of values and how those are sort of discussed and negotiated at those different levels is a really critical one, which I think we probably don't hear about nearly as much as we should. We often hear about all the sort of mechanics. So, Tegan, one of the things the statement you've produced calls for is for investment to establish a national Indigenous environmental voice that empowers place-based Indigenous-led decision-making. Can you tell us more about what this idea is about and why it's needed?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. I mean, I think, firstly, I'm remiss of me before to not acknowledge our other Indigenous co-authors to this statement, including Professor Stephen Van Leeuwen and Barry Hunter, who's the CEO of NAUSMA. I think their voice was quite strong in this statement, and I'm sure that they'll agree when we talk about a peak body to represent Indigenous ranges and IPAs. You know, we just heard Kate talk about NRM regions and who she represents. There's over 87 IPAs in Australia and over 120 ranger groups, and they don't have a peak body to be able to champion their aspirations and desire for place-based change at a regional level or at a national level. And I think that's really challenging when we talk about influencing decisions that are made centrally, particularly around things like priority places and priority species. And what we often see is that the Indigenous voice is missing from that as a consequence. And so what we're talking about is a structural change to enable the Indigenous voice and Indigenous leadership to actually champion those ideas and aspirations to change and heal country. And, you know, where does funding go? Where does action happen? And what's that alignment? I think that would go a long way in changing the, I suppose, weighting of different values, but also getting that national voice and recognition for the work that IPAs and rangers do in this space. And, you know, we've got a couple of Indigenous-led solutions that are already kind of coming up in this space to be able to, I suppose, change the system. One of those will be the Commissioner to Country, which is an Indigenous-led initiative in response to the EPBC Act. And so how do we actually have an Indigenous voice at those important decision-making elements nationally? And the other one is a project that I'm working on, which is the National Indigenous Environmental Research Network, which is really about championing Indigenous-led research ideas and priorities and methodology. And so how do we actually find those solutions to repair country and, you know, leverage on Indigenous knowledge to be able to actually shift the way that we're doing things that's not working?
Thanks, Tegan. And I think just also sort of joining some of those dots there, I guess I'm really interested in hearing as well around how you would see that National Indigenous Environmental Voice sort of interacting with the work that Kate's been talking about in terms of that NRM planning processes.
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, it's a kind of two-sided coin, right? So you're championing Indigenous voice from the ground, but you're also working quite collaboratively with universities, NRM bodies and alike to actually be able to drive common solutions. I think that a mechanism needs to be able to work across the sector, but champion Indigenous voice. And so I think, you know, that solution needs to be Indigenous-led and owned, but, you know, supporting that concept through funding is going to be the challenge, as we all well know. So yeah, I think that there's different mechanisms and different governance that will help enable that, you know, influence on the decision making.
Thanks, Tegan. I don't know, Kate, if you have any other thoughts you wanted to add to that.
Actually, just quickly, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing change in NRM over the last 20 or so years is that on-ground engagement with Indigenous communities, but also the support of Indigenous-led processes and organisations. And that's something really important, and actually something we talk to regularly with the government about, how in fact we make sure that we're not in the way, but we're actually helping ensure that there is Indigenous self-determination and economic opportunities and Indigenous-led organisations in that space. So wholeheartedly support Tegan, but also to say I think there's some great examples on the ground at that very place-based level as well of how this can work well, and I think that's actually something that is one of the things that should give us hope in this space as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kate. So I think we might go to some of the questions that are coming through from our audience here. Thank you, everyone, for submitted them. A question here from Rosie. So Tegan, do you think the Indigenous Ranger Reference Group could be the basis for this need of national influence and decision making?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rosie. I think, you know, there's a potential to use that reference group as a governance mechanism. But I think, you know, in regards to a peak body, it needs to be bigger. It needs to be an operational body that can actually reach out effectively with community on the ground to seek their input into some of these national, I suppose, priority setting processes. But I think the leadership that sits at that reference group would form a really good governance mechanism of a peak body for rangers, but I think there would be need to have more operational capacity and be separate from government to really be able to influence.
Great, thanks, Tegan. Yeah, a good question there too. We also have a question here from Sarah Turks about scaling up, and this is probably mostly for you, Mike, but you know, certainly any Kate and Tegan as well. So the call to heal document states that the capability to restore and heal country already exists. But in order to scale up, we will need resources like seeds, and we will need to recruit and train more skilled workers in restoration. So is there currently a satisfactory learning mechanism, such as accredited courses for training more restoration practitioners? And do you have an estimated figure needed for creating, adequately resourcing and continuing to employ this workforce?
Well, this is only partly for me, I think, Joe, Sarah. So we did build into the funding estimate nationally enough money to cover those sorts of areas. But this then comes down to what you need to do at a regional level or on a local level where you need to have those sorts of resources done. Now, we haven't yet got to the point where we've done anything like a spreadsheet of the cost required at that local scale. That will need to happen as part of the delivery of this process. But yes, it's not just seed, it's nursery space, it's where you fit all of those things in. It's about training. More broadly across all of the things that we're talking about here, it probably is a substantial change in the emphasis that we have in what we used to call extension services, the way in which we find new ways for people to work together to produce both increased productivity and increased ecosystem outcomes. Those things we've identified in broad terms in the document, but the detail is the next stage, and that's very important. As to accredited training courses, I've been too long retired to be able to answer that one, but I'm sure there are people out there that can do that.
Can I jump in too, Joe? I just think this is so important, and it's really important for a number of reasons. So thank you for the question. I'm not going to go to that level of detail about accredited programs, etc., but I just want to pull out several points that I think we've been making that I'd like to highlight. And that is the one about persistence, as Mike was talking about, or continuity. We have to have the long-term view to be able to do this. And one of those reasons is to have the capacity and capability and to build that. And if we continue to have stop-start funding, we damage that enormously and we lose people. So I just, this is a desperate cry out to say that continuity and persistence has to be considered. This is not just about putting money in. You can't just turn on a tap if you haven't put water in the tank. You have to have water in the tank, and you have to have a big backlog of it, and you have to have the plumbing so that when you turn on the tap, something comes out. And I feel like we tend to have a pretty simplistic attitude about these things in the way we actually run programs and finance. So persistence in that way, so we can actually develop skills and capacity and networks over time, is really important. The next thing I wanted to say about that is we often forget that it's not just about technical skills, it's actually about people and people engagement. There is no actual empty country out there. There's always people associated with that country who manage that country or love that country in some way. So to be able to actually get out there and do stuff in a place-based way, you don't just buy a widget and stick it there. You actually have to engage with and be trusted by the people in that country and work with them. And that might be farmers and actually having those trusted networks so you can work with farmers to improve agricultural practices, or it might be engaging with people to actually do restoration. But that people engagement, those people skills, is a really important, totally undervalued element of these sorts of things. And that's something that I think a number of our sectors bring to the table really importantly, but that also flips back to that persistence, because you can't just have people coming in and out of communities. That's not how you build that trust. People need to be embedded in those communities, and those relationships need to be long-term as well in order to be able to engage in the sorts of work that we need to repair Australia. So you can tell I'm quite passionate about this, because I see the damage that is done over time when we don't do this properly. Can I also just say thanks, a shout out to the fact that I got some hearts. That does make me feel so much better, and it's pretty cool, can I say, that actually seeing the hearts come up there. So yeah, the long term, the people relationships bit, To me, all of that is a really important element of actually making this work, and then having the right training and those sorts of programs in place sort of sit below that. I think Tegan probably wants to get it out.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. I think from an Indigenous perspective, you know, I think Indigenous rangers have for quite some time been championing the need to build capacity and capability within the ranger network. And whether that be, you know, as drone pilots or different monitoring, and actually seeing the sector as much broader and having meaningful pathways for them. And I think there's a lot of really positive things happening in terms of training pathways. You know, universities are getting on board. I know Curtin University is developing a whole suite of micro-credentials to enable rangers to actually develop their skills and broaden their skill set and create a pathway for them. And I think they're really important elements within this sector to be able to actually grow the workforce. And I think that retention point that Kate talked to too is really important. You know, these funding cycles that come and go, it doesn't really give people surety to stay within the sector. So, you know, I think those two coupled together are quite important.
Yeah, thanks, Sol. And I think these issues very much resonate with a lot of the, you know, the discussions we have when we do our modelling work and climate work. So there's often a lot of questions raised around, well, those sort of logistical constraints, you know, in terms of seed and labour and things like that. So we do a lot of really sort of trying to think, well, what are the insurmountable constraints and what are the surmountable ones, and what are those factors you need to put in there to make them surmountable? The things you're saying, Kate, around, yeah, the financing, the consistency in financing, but what you know, also saying, Tegan, as well, and Kate and Mike as well, around you know, the investment in those proper processes and community engagement processes, and bringing people along in those co-planning is such a critical part of it, and really sort of changes the vision of what actually is feasible and what isn't. So it's great to hear. I've got another question here from the audience from Lucy. What do you think needs to be prioritized first to get the action that you've all noted we so urgently need? Actually, I don't know if that one was from Lucy, but that's okay. And yeah, and also if you have any recommendations there for the federal government, particularly as they're developing their nature positive plan. Don't know who wants to tackle that one. Mike or Kate?
Look, I'll start just because the others are very slow to respond. Look, the fact that we're at this meeting and the fact that Wentworth identified that the next stage after the release of the blueprint was to talk to regional Australia and First Nations Australia about the next stage is that essentially what we've said is that that's the urgent priority. One of the things that I personally get frustrated with is that and this was an example, when we spoke to the federal government about this, we initially spoke to Treasury, and one of the first things that Treasury said was, well, talk to the Environment Department about this bit and the Agriculture Department about that bit. And this is what we tend to do, is we get this, let's just do this bit first because and that's at the top of the list, and maybe there are more votes in it, and we'll put all these other things aside. The whole point of the blueprint is that this all has to be done together. I noticed there's this question about the wind farms. In some ways, the wind farms is a very good example of this. We know we have to have these things, but we don't want to do it in a way in which we're going to destroy our repairing ecosystems. We have to do it in a way in which we can do both. And that applies to, well, where we fit agriculture into our system, the way we put other new industries into our system. It has to be done together. So if you ask me what's to be prioritised first, it is to revitalise and strengthen this regional NRM model and make it back to where we all envisaged that it was going to be in the early 2000s.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and that issue of the sort of the fragmentation in policy and not having the sort of integrated approach, I think is something we hear quite a lot. And yeah, and the role of sort of NRMs as being partly around addressing some of that integration at that regional level. Tegan.
Yeah, I think I was just going to follow on with that to say, when we look at the national environmental legislation reform, you know, we know Samuel the Samuel Review put forward a report. And, you know, one of the things that they spoke to straight away was to say, these are a suite of recommendations. I think there was 34 recommendations. And there was an urgency for the government to pick up all of those recommendations and implement them as a whole suite. And I think, you know, that's not dissimilar to Mike's point. You know, we really need to look at the whole system. We can't just play around the edges and hope that that will have an influence. We need to reform the whole space, and we need to, you know, embrace the change that's happening and actually move forward with it with momentum. Because if we keep just doing little bits on the side, we're not going to actually make the change that we need to.
Thank you, Tegan.
Thanks, Tegan. That was better put than I did it. Thank you.
Kate, are you wanting to add anything to that?
I think they both said it beautifully. Same, really,
Yeah.
from me. I was trying to resist the downer comment, which is, you know, I do get sick of the fact that anything in the environment space is seen as a nice to have, not a need to have. So it's how one actually changes and embeds the work that we do across the whole of government. So totally with Mike. Can I just a little whinge on the side, given I'm being the one with the negative hat on. I do find it endlessly amazing that people, economists and people in finance and treasury, sort of it doesn't necessarily occur to them that they rely on the water they drink, the food they eat, the air they breathe, you know, the environment they rely on for spiritual solace or you know, aesthetic input, etc., etc. It endlessly surprises me that we have to be making this case, and I suspect that a lot of us who are here today are people who already believe in this, and it's how we actually manage to cut through so that this does become something that, and you see that happen in other countries where they're actually, and it has happened in Australia in the past, where we have actually had commissions or agencies that are actually established to ensure that these sorts of considerations are embedded across the whole of government, and they're not marginalised in a department or departments that are lower on the pecking order. And I just think, you know, there are actually fundamental institutional changes that you can make to ensure that the whole of government is held to account with its decision making in this regard. And this issue of the energy transition and minimising negative impact that Mike brought up then, I think, is a classic example of that. We shouldn't be brought in at the end and retrofitted. This should be about ensuring that we actually minimise impact and maximise the positive outcomes which can occur for people as well as for the environment from this work. And this is where I think the long-term planning becomes such an important element as well. We also just need accountability, Joe. I think that's the other thing that frustrates me. Tegan's just talked about, you know, a review that we've been, you know, seeking to implement and things. And it's not just accountability at the political scale, but accountability for institutions as well. That becomes a really important way of ensuring that we actually meet these goals rather than just talking about it.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And I think this is a really good segue. So some of the we're getting some great questions here from the audience. So one of these, Andrea just asked. So how do we manage that policy fragmentation, and how do we bring about that social change that forces that to happen? So we do have this sort of more integrated approach.
Is that one being thrown? Am I getting that? I noticed Mike's
Yes,
looking down. Mike's doing, it's like that, the kid in the class, isn't it? Where you look away when the teacher asks the tough question. Look, that's the million, well, what should it be now? The $1 billion question, really, isn't it? Is how do we get that change? And I sort of feel like, oh my goodness, if we knew and if it was easy, that would have been done. So I'm afraid I have no silver bullets. There are no silver bullets, but I do want to bring in that point too. And you made it beautifully, as well as Mike before. And that is that when we do that integration and that whole of government are working across, we do it at multiple scales. And that is one thing that happens, you know, with regional NRM. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But really, we do actually manage to knit together those different values and priorities and investments. So we try and create that whole of government. We are actually dealing with multiple different agencies as well as different communities and different industries to try and knit it together at that landscape scale, and then also trying to do it in the vertical scale. So trying to take on board national government priorities, Australian government priorities, and state or territory priorities, and knit that together with community priorities. So I'm just making it more complicated, not less complicated. Sorry, Andrea, but I do believe that we do some of that at our scale. I focus mainly on the Australian government. I don't think we have achieved that at the Australian government level. I don't think it's my area of expertise, but I do know that we can do it a lot better than we are now. And to be honest, I do get frustrated that I have to go and justify our activities across multiple portfolios and ministers, such as climate adaptation and resilience and agriculture and environment, you know, and Indigenous affairs and you know, and health and all of those sorts of things. So looking for solutions, and I think we can also find some of them back in attempts that have been made in the past in Australia's arrangements. I think, Tegan, you wanted to say something, yeah?
Yeah, I was just also going to offer, you know, from that policy governance point of view, I think we need to shift how we make decisions. You know, we often just consider economic. We really need to move to that quadruple bottom line where we're talking about economic, environmental, social, and cultural outcomes for those decisions that are being made, so that we are actually thinking about the environment in which we live in a more holistic way instead of this transactional economic benefit. So I think, you know, there's the integrated landscapes that Kate was talking to, and, you know, I mean, I think we've got some mechanisms that are coming forward through potentially through the EPBC Act reform with regional planning, but I think that regional planning as a mechanism itself can be bolstered to do a lot more than what it's currently proposed to do, particularly if we shift how we make those decisions.
And I think it's really important too, because we use the language has been used in different places. And I think the regional planning mechanism as it's now shaping up in the EPBC Act is not particularly participatory or integrated. So, you know, I think there might be a wasted opportunity there unless we actually push. So I think Tegan's jumped onto something, which is where these changes are in play, we have an opportunity to influence those changes to get a better outcome for all of us as well in that regard. And I think that becomes a really important element of what we're calling for, and also part of the priority question that was asked of us before too, is how we can actually engage with what's happening now and make the most of it. I think there's one other question too, one other point I'd like to make there too, and that is that sometimes I feel like we get played off where we do actually we're handed a bit of money or a program or whatever it might be, but meanwhile we still have policy settings or legislative settings that are allowing negative change or negative impact. And that's a really important thing. Sometimes we as sectors and as people who work in this need to be able to step back and say, hold on a sec, is this bit that we're being distracted by actually the bit that's really making the difference here? And that's where it becomes important that we work and collaborate across all of our sectors and all our different ways of working, so that we can be ensuring that we're covering off on all of those things. I just feel it's a really important one, because if the scale of damage that's occurring is still greater than the efforts that we're making and the investment that we're making, then we're not going to get the changes that we actually need. So that's still a really important part of the discussion that we need to have.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Kate. It's really well said. I think this is actually a good link. There's a question which has been here for a while, which I think is a really important one as well, by Keith Peakin, saying that collectively we have the solutions and the blueprint as a great pathway forward. Can our politicians make the big, purposeful, future-leaning decisions to act on this? And how can we better engage the broader voting community, and through them our politicians? So really understanding the role of, you know, sort of the broader community in sort of promoting this change too. I don't know, Mike, if you want to have a go at this one.
Well, thanks, Joe. You give me all the easy ones. I think one of the attractions about doing this the way we did it, which was to be as systemic as we could. Now, I know that NRM Australia was disappointed we didn't include the sea, but you can do that now. But to try and be as systemic as we could, because all parties and most politicians actually occur about something that happens across our landscapes. And the tendency that we've had in recent times, as you're all aware, is for each side to focus on one or two of those things and to find a point of difference. But this actually argues for the fact that these things are all interconnected at the regional level, and you can't change one without damaging the other. So to get to the point of to end up with a much more nuanced political discussion here, we actually need to put our effort into having people understand that all of the things we do in our regions interact with each other, and we can't just concentrate on one of them to the detriment of others, because in the long term, all of those things suffer in that process. So there is material here, and there is material and other things that are happening. And Joe's group at Climate Works, with their Land Use Futures work, is very much in this space to get to the point where we work across the political spectrum more effectively to make it clear that systemic approach is in everybody's interest. Now, that can sound apple pie and optimistic, but the alternative is that we keep going backwards. And I think we'll get to the point where sufficient catastrophes happen that people will start to understand this. It'd be nice if we avoided that in the first place and we had this other broader approach. But again, coming back to that question about renewable energy in our landscape, it's a very good example. We can't say no because we actually have now become dependent upon it. So we have to answer that with how. And then how becomes, how do you do that at the same time as maintaining these other values that are important? And then you've got an opportunity of having a conversation across the political divide. I just hope that it can happen.
Joe, can I jump in and emphasize a point? Thank you. And it's about risk reduction. Like I also think, so we haven't yet really talked about, and sorry, I'm moving off, the joint statement itself. But the nature-based solutions element, I think, is a really strong one here as well. So in trying to make the case to across government and across people with influence, decision makers with influence, this issue about what's important to them, as Mike was saying, including, for example, businesses, what's important to them isn't just necessarily about the inherent value of the environment as we see it, or of our livelihoods and lifestyles associated with that, but it can be the risk equation. And this is where I think it's really important too, where one of the things we're trying to do is show that nature-based solutions can actually reduce risk, not just for the environment, but for people, for infrastructure, for businesses, etc. And that's, I think, a really good one, because it's showing that you can be part of the solution. So you're investing for a benefit and an outcome, in a different way. And we've seen that come through in, the nature repair market from the Australian government as a way of doing that. We've seen that with some of the global drivers and expectations upon corporations and businesses, etc. But I think the risk reduction one is another really strong case to be able to make for actually getting that broader buy-in, and not just in our political sector, but also in our private sector as well. So I think that's another one that becomes really, really key.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah. Good point. And there's a number of other questions I think sort of relate to these issues that we've been discussing here, which, including very much this question around financing as well. So one of these is from Peter Voller, which is how much of the cost of a long-term substantial funding mechanism should be carried by government? And what is your feeling about uptake of the idea of generational investment from government and from business since the release of the blueprint? So maybe, sorry, that best for you again, Mike, to start with.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'll start. Thanks, Peter. It's a good question, and there are 2 or 3 other questions I think that are connected to this. So let's start to explore these. In the blueprint, we actually said that a range of financing mechanisms is needed. That we did not assume that this would only be coming out of the election cycle to election cycle budget of governments, but that we needed something broader than that. And we talked about investment in the Australian government green bond framework. We talked about the role that carbon markets played in this, and we estimated that the carbon market might play to around, this is off the top of my head, something like 15 to 20% of the need in this funding space. So by no means all of it. And of course, it is important that you don't allow that to, again, come away from the systemic response. There's always a danger with a particular form of funding leading to perverse outcomes, and carbon is, I think, there's very good opportunity for carbon to do that, so we need to manage that. But we also talked about a growing interest in the private sector who are interested in conservation on private land, but they're also interested in investing in clear, sustainable outcomes that are relevant to their businesses, and in philanthropy and a range of others. So, and I know that in the call that we made as part of before this meeting, that we call for a permanent fund which allows this sort of work to happen. So we do recognise that this is not going to be solved with the ups and downs of annual and electoral cycle funding. It needs to be more substantial than that, and it needs to be broader based than that. That's probably enough from me, because we didn't actually resolve these questions. We raised them. We have raised them with government, and we hope to continue those conversations. But we're at the start of this process, and I guess the other thing that I would say, Wentworth Group has a long history of doing pieces of work which are then, and the value of which is then not realised for some time, and that applies to work we've done in water, the work we did in environmental accounting, etc., which for example is now only starting to find a place in the private sector. So don't if this doesn't happen tomorrow, don't despair. This is a long burning issue. The idea of this work is to start a conversation that we hope, with the growth of wisdom in our political masters, we will see an end to the problems that we have at the moment.
Thanks, Mike. Kate, looks like you have.
Yeah, I do, and a couple of points I want to make, and thanks, Mike. Mike has been fielding tough questions, and poor Tegan hasn't been getting much opportunity. But just quickly too, I think in Australia we're quite bad at acknowledging where we have done things well. And I think, for example, regionalisation across Australia in the early 2000s, a Council of Australian Governments sort of decision is actually a really excellent example where we realised from first principles we needed to do these things. We've been very bad at sustaining that. But going back a few more steps, the Natural Heritage Trust, which was not necessarily established for the best of reasons, it was from the sale of Telstra, the decision to actually create a Natural Heritage Trust in perpetuity from some of the results of that sale of Telstra was actually a really good decision. And sure, it's not sufficient funds, but the fact that we actually have a funding base through the Natural Heritage Trust in perpetuity that feeds into Indigenous land and sea management, into NRM, into land care, into other activities, is really quite a significant thing. And I think we tend to sort of undervalue and under-recognise that. So for me too, there's the opportunity to actually use existing mechanisms. So for example, the government to increase the capital value within the Natural Heritage Trust and use the existing mechanisms as it does for those is one example. But it's also just a way of saying, hey, we have in the past managed to do these things and set them up for the long term. So it's just something to just remember when we're doing that. Another quick one too is I think like all of us probably, none of us believe the public sector or government can step away. And that's partly because there's a whole lot of actually quite unsexy stuff that needs to happen and intangible stuff that needs to happen for us to deliver all these other things. And you know, it's actually going to be quite tricky, and anyone who's ever chased private funds knows this, to actually get just private investment sort of filling in all of that. And even this government itself acknowledges that the additional private investment will help amplify and leverage the activity that needs to happen, but it won't be sufficient in and of itself. And as Mike said, and if we don't do it damn well, we will end up with perverse outcomes. So for us, I think that's just a really important emphasis to be able to make around those issues too of funding. I don't think I've added a lot to the question, but just some really key points. I also think this is where being sophisticated in how we do our public-private sector interaction becomes important, because we've seen examples across Australia in very different sectors where the public sector picks up the cost if there's a problem or a risk, whereas the private sector has sometimes picked up the benefit. And there are a lot of sectors in Australia where that's been the case. So being sophisticated in how we understand the public sector frameworks and arrangements that need to be in place to help enable private investment is a really important part of the policy puzzle that we need to be pushing for as well. And that also is about civil society and civil society arrangements too. And I'm sure some of the people who are joining us come from just fantastic NGOs out there, such as some of our NRMs, who really play a significant role in actually pulling this all together to get those results.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And really, yeah, it's good sort of complex issues around those sort of funding mechanisms. And you're right, sort of need for a very sort of diversified approach, which leads me, let me get to this next question, which, because I think it's quite related to what both you, Kate, and Mike have been talking about, and also Tegan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this issue around funding as well. Where we have Esther Abrams saying, while the 30-year funding approach makes perfectly good sense, the reality is that funding decisions of government take place through election cycles and then annual budgets. So however, our hypothecated fund, where Australians contribute like they do to health, makes the funding much more secure. And have you looked into this? I don't know, Tegan, if you have thoughts about this particular one or around sort of the funding issues generally, or happy to hand over to others here.
Oh, look, I'm happy to hand over to the others. I think, you know, they've both touched on it quite well. I will say, though, from the Indigenous estate perspective, you know, it is undervalued and under-resourced, particularly when we compare it to things like national parks, for what it delivers. So there does need to be some thought around the equity of the distribution of those funds and what that means, so that, you know, some of our really remote ranges can actually fulfill their obligations to care for country.
Yeah, a good point, Tegan. Good. Kate, you took it.
I think Mike's probably the hypothecated funds person. But I just wanted to build upon Tegan's point too, that we sometimes forget with the intergenerational efforts as well, that I think are really important. And by the way, I think the NHT actually has been a mechanism of holding funds that can be in perpetuity beyond just election cycles. So just an addition to that question, I think that very example was one of those. But I also just want to move away just from funding and say, I think some of the intergenerational investment that we need to make goes back to Tegan's point, actually about investing in our young people, so our young people are out on country and learning over time, etc. So I think there's also sometimes, you know, maybe we need to reframe the values and assets type of discussion and be thinking about it with regards our upcoming generations and their knowledge and skills and connection to country, and just what value there is in, you know, investing in that. So that's a little bit of a curveball, but I just think sometimes we need to broaden the way we're thinking about these things as well. Yeah, and weirdly enough, it takes us all the way back to the Brundtland Report and intergenerational equity through sustainable development, doesn't it? Mike, you can deal with hypothecated funds.
No, I can't. I don't have a lot to add to what we've been talking about. If you go to the report, you will see that we talk about options in this space. Those conversations haven't been completed. We need to pursue them more. I think our ability to do that will be strengthened when it is clear that we have this regional leadership for how we envisage change is going to happen, so that there is a clearer. What the Wentworth Group has done is put in front of the Australian community a case for investment. The next stage, I think, is a plan for investment, and that plan for investment needs to have a clear view about how we're going to drive change, who's going to lead that change, and then to make a case for there being vehicles for investment to flow through. And that's the next stage. We don't have that answer yet. Doesn't mean it's not a really important question, but it also doesn't mean that it stops us from our next stage, which is to move into that planning phase.
Yeah, interesting, Mike. Again, useful to sort of hear that progression, the sequencing of that work. Tegan, I might go to you actually this is another sort of funding related question, but we have a question from Elizabeth. Where does philanthropy fit into Indigenous land, sea and water care and protection?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an important revenue, and there's obviously a lot more momentum more recently, particularly from international philanthropic. But I think it's also got a really unlocked potential. And we talked before about capacity building and capability building, and I think, you know, that's a skill that we all need to be better at. You know, how do we secure funding outside of government cycles? So, you know, how do we actually grow our capacity to seek and find those funds? And also, I think the other thing, just to touch back on with the funding, that I was sort of thinking, you know, even though we've got the National Heritage Trust funding, you know, often what happens, particularly with rangers, is that every 7 years they reapply for that funding. I mean, I think we also need to acknowledge the huge administrative burden that happens through those processes, and also the momentum that gets dropped because of the uncertainty of what will happen as an outcome from that administrative purpose. And so, you know, I think we start to make momentum, we start to actually get some really good goals and traction and change, and then all of a sudden we're back to applying for funding and justifying that funding allocation again. And I also think the other side of that too is those KPIs and reporting mechanisms don't necessarily align with the place-based aspirations for that country and what they want to achieve. It's really, you know, sometimes it can be seen more in terms of that economic driver of how many jobs did you get, not actually what did we achieve in that environmental outcome. So that whole funding conversation, again, you know, we touched on it. It needs to be a whole system reform about how we do it. It's not just simply let's throw the money out. We need to think about how it's delivered.
Yeah, thanks, Tegan, for that. That's very helpful. And I think another question here I'd like to pose to you, and interested in your thoughts. We have well, first of all, let me just I see Andrea saying, yes, so many sectors benefit from our landscapes. They should all be contributing to repair. I think that's a very good point as well. It's about how, you know, we do see this in a very, you know, in a very sort of holistic way where everyone plays their role. But there's a question here from Michael Kennedy, who has mentioned a range of resources and opportunities for Indigenous sovereignty training and work going on in New South Wales, but also said that that some of these questions and comments leads me to write that funding needs to be reflective of Aboriginal seasonal calendars for the environmental work that needs to be done from reading and listening to country and not by a Roman calendar. Do you have thoughts around that? Is this a...
Yeah, I think, you know, this is a way of shifting how we think in this space and really actually meaningfully integrating Indigenous knowledge into the sector. And that can be done multiple ways. I mean, it touches on the funding stuff too and the siloed approach that we have. You know, if we start to look at environmental programs through the lenses of things like biocultural indicators, where we actually start to look at health and well-being, environmental outcomes, social outcomes as well, and we actually start to see a joined up system, you know, and then we can start to say, well, funding can be allocated from these different buckets, but also we can start to see those aspirations for being on country. I think one of the points I sort of talk about when we talk about restoration is that if we look at it just through an environmental lens, we'll be talking about how many trees are planted. If we look at it, that same restoration activity through using Indigenous knowledge, you know, those outcomes and outputs will be very different than sending a crew out to plant 1,000 trees in, you know, half a day or whatever it is. You know, we're talking about getting our old people out on country. We're talking about intergenerational knowledge transfer. We're talking about people actually connecting and being present on country. And when we think about that from a cost perspective, it's very different. But also when we think about it from an outcome perspective, it's also very different. So, you know, it's about how do we actually look at the whole system and say that, you know, this environmental restoration is a vehicle for more change than just those straight environmental outcomes. And I think then we start to see the system come together. And to Michael's point around that funding, you know, it's about saying, actually, country is changing. And we know that. We've heard Mike and Kate both talk about climate change. And that's one of the really beautiful things about Indigenous knowledge, is that it is adaptive to country and it can see what those cues are when things need to change. And I truly do believe that, you know, the answer to some of these wicked conservation problems, Indigenous knowledge does hold the answer if we are open to listening.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, interesting points, Rachel. Tegan, sorry. So it's both those issues about the timing, but really about how we're understanding what the outcomes are in a much more holistic way. I guess that sort of connects back to some of the sort of measuring what matters work underway as well. Yeah, thanks for that. Let's move away from the funding related questions a little bit here. So we have a question from Rochelle. Is it still the case that the environment does not have recognised rights in our constitution, contrary to New Zealand and Ecuador? And I guess a follow-on question I might add is, well, if that's the case, is this something that we should be, you know, putting some effort towards? I don't know who wants to take that up. Kate, you went off mute.
I took it off mute because I think this probably, Rochelle, this is actually generally outside of our areas. But interestingly enough, where there has been recognition, such as the rights of a river being recognised legally, so that that river has standing and is, in a sense, recognised as a person and able to take legal action, that's often been driven by Indigenous peoples in those countries. Because it's part of that understanding of actually saying of country as people, as kin. So it's a really interesting one. I would actually love to know how much difference it's made, whether having legal rights of for example, a New Zealand river or others has actually changed the result and the outcome for that river. So I think symbolically it's wonderful. But I would love to actually see whether it's actually achieved any results in that way, because only then I think would it be worthwhile being something that we actually fight for.
Yeah, I'd like to know the answers to those questions too. I don't know, Mike or Tegan, if you have anything to add to this.
I think that there are some really strong Indigenous leaders that are going down that kind of path to have some of our systems recognised as ancestral beings and the right to speak for those pieces of water, those bodies of water. But I think, you know, we can take some learnings from our colleagues in New Zealand and Ecuador around what kind of went wrong with their policy. I know that the New Zealand case well, the last I was reading, that one of the key issues was that there was no water allocation given to the being. So, you know, I think that's a pretty fundamental thing if you're going to talk about rights in a river. So, you know, I think there's definitely learnings where Australia can do a similar kind of model, but in a much stronger sense. So, yeah, look, I think there's some really interesting stuff happening globally that Australia can take lead from.
Mm.
You know, I guess the only other comment that I would make, Joe, if I have a second here, is I would run a view across this to ensure that we're still able to look systemically across the whole of the region. It worries me that we're getting into this is the Environment Department's bit rather than the whole of government's bit, and therefore we may end up with outcomes that we don't want, or we may end up without being able to achieve the integrated outcomes that as a society we need. So that would be my only question.
Yeah, interesting question. And it would be really good to hear how that has also played out in places like Ecuador and New Zealand too, if that has been a consequence. I might move on to another one, this is a nice question from Cynthia. I'm interested in that process part that you're all speaking to at the local level. Could you share your favorite story that brings together the challenges that different values bring and how trust was built through local long-term relationships, leading to action that's made a difference? And what were the challenges and how were they overcome? So that's a big question, but yeah, it'd be lovely to hear some sort of on the ground stories. Tegan, would you be up to sharing something?
I was just racking my brain trying to think of an example if Kate or Mike have got one first.
Sure.
There are so many. So Cynthia, this is unfair because it's a bit like picking your favorite child. And you know, when you're actually CEO of a peak body, can I say that's not a very wise move to pick a favorite child? I will quickly point you in the direction. I will actually do one, but one that takes us so far back that hopefully I won't be pinged for it. But there are so many examples, and this is what actually gets me excited and brings me hope, is when I talk with regional NRM colleagues on the ground and the examples of the work they do. And it is really interesting how you can have global drivers pushed down through governments or through other sources and end up with good stuff happening on the ground, and not just at a local, but you know, I think at that broader landscape scale. So look, whether it's to do with threatened species, whether it's to do with managing your soil better so you have better productivity, whether it's to, you know, there's so much out there, Cynthia. But look, a quick example from me that was one of the favourites that I had, goes way back, and actually I've circled back around to play a role in it again, is actually the Lake Eyre Basin. And it was working with people across the Lake Eyre Basin quite some years ago to throw aside jurisdictional boundaries, because as someone reminded me just the other day, water doesn't stop at a boundary, pigs don't stop at a boundary. So, you know, how do we work together to actually manage country in a way that makes sense for country and for people, as opposed to, you know, bureaucracies and those other systems. And through the Lake Eyre Basin process, there was a genuine sharing and coming together in a safe forum, in a way where people with usually very different opinions from very different parts of this vast, important area of Australia could have trusted conversations and build a vision of the future that they wanted to actually share. And that was motivated by a number of different things, including a couple of international pushes, one being for World Heritage listing. And it was just a really positive example of how people managed to talk about how they could work together to look after a place that they cared about, despite very different backgrounds and very different what's the right word, interests, I guess, and ones that would normally be considered to clash. And that is something that I think is very powerful. And I did just want to say too, I think this goes back to a number of the questions people have asked about what's the solution. I just want to highlight Mike's point, which is saying none of us alone can actually present a solution, because it won't be right if one of us alone actually presents it. I think the whole point here is the conversation, it is the collaboration, it is working this out together, and that there are multiple ways we can do this, and through working together we will come up with the multiple ways to do this. But that very process to me is fundamental to how we all work and why we're all engaged in doing what we do. So I just really wanted to highlight that point, even though I'm off topic from Cynthia's question. Now, Tegan, have I bought you enough time that you can give a kick-ass specific example that's way less esoteric than mine?
Look, I think most of my kind of examples are in different spaces, but I think, you see lots of different components. I mean, I was thinking, which I wasn't directly involved in, but the response to the Lismore and the Northern Rivers, to the floods and fires that happened there. I mean, I think that's a really impressive story about lots of different groups and different industries coming together in response. And that's still happening now. And I was lucky enough to go to community not long after and actually talk to them about what their, as in the Bundjalung community, about what their aspirations for community were and for country and to heal country. And, they were very much of that aspect that, we need to work together and that they want to build those partnerships. And I think that that's one of the positive shifts that I see at different scales across the country, is that real willingness to actually work together in a genuine sense. I think when challenges come from those collaborative spaces, it is usually related to the final decision making that's linked to the funding, which was where we kind of started the conversation. So yeah, I think that there is lots of really positive examples that everyone can look to into their own backyard.
Yeah, thanks, Tegan. I think very common threads we're hearing here around that, the importance of the collaboration, of doing it with others, that real meaningful involvement and engagement and all. So that's great. So look, there's been a lot of other
Sorry, Jo, just a quick one from me. I think it's well worth pointing out the Health, Land and Water experience in Southeast Queensland, which is a partnership across local government, state government, and the regional body, and essentially has used really robust measures of the health of the waterways to then tell us about the health of the land. And that's been maintained over decades. I don't know how long, maybe 15 to 20 years. And it puts enormous pressure back on governmental officials and governments, because the numbers don't lie, and then they have to do something about what is the health of that country and how it's then playing out into the rivers. It's always seemed to me to be a remarkable example of how you can build these things in a way that lasts.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good to hear that. Now, I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to everybody's questions. We're coming up on time, but let me just finish with one last question. And this is from Kate Forrest. I think this is a very nice way to finish it up, which is, so what are the next steps for the report and the call to heal statement? Who needs to get on board? Who wants to go? Tegan?
Tegan, well, look, I think for me, we all need to take the statement as a call to action, and we need to think about what we can do in our own backyard, but also at a collective level to actually champion the statement and the blueprint. And, I think we could kind of all become a bit pessimistic about, what our vote does in terms of changing the government's opinion. But I think, there's a power in a collective. And so, if you share this message with one other person after this workshop, that there is things that we can do to change the outlook for Australia, then I think that that's a positive thing.
Thanks, Tegan. And Kate and Mike, do you want to add any last few quick words in response to that question?
Very quick words from me, where we want to sit back and watch the leadership come from the organisations that are going to move it to the next stage of planning. We'll be there to help, but really the next stage now, the next thing to do is to move this into a planning process.
So for me, I'll be talking with all of our NRMers and the NRM organisations more closely about this, and with partners about what happens next. And can I say, all of us are always undertaking this work and out there making this case, and this, I think, strengthens that. And helps add weight and amplifies what we're doing in the case that we're making anyway. So we're looking forward to taking the strength of this collaboration and the statement, working, as Mike said, with our partners and with our regions, and pushing the case even more strongly at the federal level through a number of different doors and options, and with a number of different partners.
Great, thank you both, all three of you. That's I think that's a wrap. There's been a lot of really great questions and comments, and we know there's a lot more to add, as there always is. But I think this has been a really fruitful discussion. So really appreciate your insights, Kate, Mike, and Tegan, and everybody's questions and comments in the chat. We'll now just open up the chat for any final thoughts and comments, and we will be sending the link to this recording to you all, so you can share this important conversation as we work together to progress our call to heal Australia's land, seas, and waterways. That's been put together by these folk, and thank you all for coming and for all your great questions.
Thank you, and thank you very much to colleagues, Tegan and Mike, and our invisible colleagues who actually helped with the joint statement behind the scenes, and you'll see their names listed at the bottom of the joint statement. So I really want to thank all of those people who have helped make this possible as well. Joe, big thank you to you for jumping in and actually hosting this session for us from ClimateWorks. You've done an admirable job, and we really appreciate it. So thanks a lot for that too. You brought a lot of knowledge about the space to this discussion, so much appreciated.
Well, thank you, and thanks also, of course, to Rachel, Sarge, and Trish, which did all the hard work behind the scenes.